Hi, everyone. As we gather together, please take time to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you are joining us from and what organization, community, parish, diocese you are representing today. As you enter in, please know that these sessions are recorded as we will be utilizing them for ongoing use. My name is Margaret Matty-Ospich. I serve as the Executive Director of Word and Witness, a national community dedicated to catechesis and evangelization. I serve on the steering committee for the Catholic Cares Coalition and am honored to be with you today. The Catholic Cares Coalition consists of 57 Catholic organizations dedicated to 3 goals. 1, to leverage communication channels and resources to share consistent information about the importance and moral responsibility of individuals to accept a COVID-19 vaccine when available. 2, to provide human, spiritual, and pastoral support for those struggling to understand, affirm, and act on Catholic social teaching, including the teachings of Pope Francis and the U.S. Catholic bishops. 3, to advocate for the equitable distribution of the vaccine in the U.S. and globally. You can find more information, resources, and news updates about the coalition on our website, CatholicCares.org, or you can follow the hashtag CatholicCares. Today is the 3rd of 5 formation sessions. This session, entitled Preparing for Fall, aims to explore how we plan for the fall while being mindful of the ever-changing dynamics we are all living within. We will explore questions like, what role does value-based decision-making play in our efforts? How do we use digital methods to innovate and move forward? And in what ways are we intentional about fostering in-depth dialogue in our communities? With the potential of the tremendous strain on our healthcare systems with the rising impact of the Delta variant, we certainly have much to consider in all our decision-making. Today's session will be led by 3 awesome church leaders. Jared Bryson, he serves as the Vice President of Mission and Church Relationships for Mercy, based out of St. Louis, Missouri, where he has served for the past 13 years in various mission-related leadership roles and has continued to serve us with Catholic Cares. Dr. Bryson holds a Master of Divinity from Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis and a doctorate in Christian spirituality from Washington Theological Union in DC. He recently published in Health Progress, the Journal of the Catholic Health Association, an article entitled A Formation Ecology in the Digital Age. We also have with us Douglas Leal, who is currently the Chief Mission Integration Officer with Providence, a multi-state Catholic health system. Previously, he was the Director of the Division of Adult Faith Formation with the Office of Religious Education in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. He also has experience as a management consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers and as a professional actor and director. Douglas is a frequent speaker on spirituality, faith formation, liturgy, and other topics, and he delivers retreats and seminars nationwide. He's the author of the skill-building book for lectors, Stop Reading and Start Proclaiming, and its forthcoming 2nd edition, Beyond Reading, Advanced Training for Proclaimers of the Word. It is published by Liturgy Training Publications. He co-authored the 2017 and 18 editions of LTP's workbook for lectors, and he holds an MA from the Boston College of Theology and Ministry. You can find more about Douglas at douglasleal.com. Also, we have with us our prayer leader, John Michael Reyes, who serves as a spiritual director throughout all of these sessions. And he positions us for a posture of prayerful discernment as we walk through all of these themes together. He is the spiritual life coordinator and director of prayer and worship for Sacred Heart Schools. He assists with Team RCIA, a free online resource for catechumenate ministry, and he has experience as a hospital chaplain, retreat director, and a campus minister for Jesuit universities, particularly in the areas of liturgy and sacramental formation. He holds a Master of Divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University and is currently in the certificate program for liturgical art and architecture at St. John's School of Theology and Seminary. His writings can be found at 23rd Publications, Liturgical Press, Liturgy Training Publications, and Paulus Press. So welcome to Jared, Douglas, and John Michael. So as we enter into this experience, we ask that you keep your microphones muted. Today's sessions will allow for large group Q&A and unpacking. So I ask that you take time throughout, if you have a question gnawing at you during a speaker's presentation, to please utilize the chat feature so we can begin to curate some of those questions and do our best to directly address them. Thanks in advance for your participation. I'm now going to pass it over to John Michael Reyes.
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are and wherever the Spirit has brought you to this moment. I'm grateful to be here and to lead in prayer for this important topic about preparing for the fall. As I was driving around, I just started to notice the leaves turning their colors and realizing, oh my gosh, where has this year gone? And with that, I'm always looking ahead of where will I be and what will I be doing? And how can I see where God is walking with me on this pilgrimage of life, especially during this pandemic? And so, with that, I invite us into a posture of prayer. So, let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Before we begin our prayer, I invite all of us in our community right now to hold two things in mind. As you may have heard, a lot happened over the weekend. Our hearts go out to the people of Haiti as they are once again hit with a terrible tragedy. Catholic Medical Mission Board is an active member of the Catholic Cares Coalition and has strong ties to Haiti. They have long-term partnerships within both the Ministry of Health and local communities, bringing improved access to health care. We invite you to keep their staff and all those who are affected by this tragedy in your thoughts and prayers as well. And second, we turn our gaze to the people of Afghanistan. As Pope Francis reminded us yesterday, or invited us yesterday at the conclusion of the Angelus, let us unite in prayer to the God of peace, so that the clamor of weapons might cease and solutions can be found at the table of dialogue. On the heels of yesterday's solemnity of the Assumption, we ask for the intercession of the Blessed Mother. And so just as Pope Francis invited people yesterday, I invite you to pray with me. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So for today's session, friends, we focus on preparing for the fall. And this prayer now is about the practice of intention as a practice that helps us to see God and be in the world with purpose. And so in this prayer, it's going to be actually a short meditation. A few weeks ago, when we had our first session, I spoke about the word that St. Ignatius of Loyola uses in his spiritual exercises, and it's familiar to most of us in faith communities, the word grace. Today, I would like to nuance that in words that might be familiar to all of us in our faith communities, especially those that we lead, by the words setting and intention. I believe that setting an intention helps us enact our stories in the world as a way of being. At times I see it as different from setting a goal. When we set a goal, we are about a way of doing, like envisioning a specific outcome, planning the steps to achieve it, and getting started at the beginning and working hard to achieve that outcome. In helpful ways, goal making provides direction for action. And so for this opening prayer, I invite us to open ourselves to another way of moving into action. These past few weeks, we have reflected on the stories of our lives through the communal life in the church, through the boldness of resting with emerging data, and how all these stories fit into the spectrum of our lives when we connect them to God's story and to the stories of our communities in light of the human, spiritual, and pastoral support in promoting vaccine equity. How can we enact our stories? How do we live into the discomfort of data that is constantly changing? How do we speak to the realities that we face? What resources or processes could be helpful? So I invite us to a way of praying this afternoon that will open us up to the way God is moving in all things. So by setting an intention, we position ourselves to be aware of this present moment and to be open to the movement of God within them. To look forward to our next most faithful step. So wherever you are, I invite you, as you are able, to close your eyes. Take a deep breath and slowly exhale. Make sure that both feet are touching the floor, that you're seated comfortably. Both hands resting palms down on your thighs. Have a sense of your body, a sense of where you are. Notice your breathing. The breath coming in and out, in and out. As you are able, and as your breath goes in and out, notice the smells of the room you're in. Maybe there are noises around you. What sounds are around you? Are they loud, quiet, near, or far? As you continue to breathe, think about how you will be today at this hour. How do you intend to be present to this time of formation? By listening? By speaking? Bring the gaze of your thoughts to your intention. And when you feel ready, open your eyes, take a deep breath in, and slowly exhale. Grounded in our intention to be present, we will open our hearts, our ears, and our eyes so that we may see the movement of God right now in all things, in the stories of our lives, in the questions that we will ask and be asked, and in the paradigms we will be presented with. May the God of wisdom be with all of us in this next hour. Amen. And I would like to turn it over to Jared for his presentation.
Thank you, John Michael. I appreciate the prayer and centeredness into place, and Margaret for the introduction. Go ahead and bring up those slides. Thank you very much. You may be familiar with this image. On March 27th, 2020, in a place where thousands usually gathered to catch the glimpse and hear the words of hope, a solitary figure, yes, there's one other person in the picture, but the solitary figure of Pope Francis stood in St. Peter's Square. And grappling with the pandemic conditions, he offered prayer and supplications to God on behalf of all humanity in this extraordinary blessing. In a place where millions would normally gather, crushed in on each other, millions watched and joined in prayer, all virtually. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, this Urbi et Orbi prayer service reserved for the church's most solemn occasions was moving. It was simple and yet straightforward. It stood in stark contrast to most of our papal liturgies that are full of crowds and pageantry. It was a defining moment for the future of the church and our own faith experience. And this shift to virtual prayer gathering also signaled a shift in our experience of communal prayer and our relationship with one another. You know, as I look at the current conditions where we sit, I'm in Mercy, based in St. Louis. We cover a 4-state region here in the Midwest. Our current staffing changes that continue to develop as the COVID variant rises, the challenges with that. Nationwide, they're expecting 3 in 10 healthcare professionals are considered leaving the profession as the Delta variant then surges and rises of other variants in our communities. Here in Mercy, we're seeing higher levels than the original pandemic surges. Our hospitals are full. Actually, over the weekend, our hospital in Oklahoma City said we have no more beds and we have a waiting list of people to try and come in. This, as the pandemic continues to surge, the polarization of masking mandates and polarization of vaccination causes more cases of spikes in our hospitals and in our communities. The rhetoric that continues to polarize and our capacity continues to be hampered by these staffing shortages, as well as long-term compassion fatigue. We continue to mobilize our pastoral care resources and various formation opportunities to renew and focus on caring for our coworkers. Each of our locations has those oversights focused on caring for the coworkers to try and help nourish them. But the pandemic continues to bring about changes on how we continue to form and nourish our coworkers and leaders. And in the experience of as an incarnate ministry, even when we have this discarnate reality of remote work, for most of us, we were focused on getting back to normal. There's no getting back to normal. As a matter of fact, some of the bias that we share is that if we're focused on getting back to normal, we're missing some of the great opportunity. I know it sounds challenging to say, but our recent attempt at getting back to normal has prolonged the pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic will continue to challenge our paradigms, so much so that some are calling this that great reset. But we have to recognize that we move forward with this. So in the chat, go back to, sorry, there we go. In the chat, I'm going to ask you, think about what paradigms are being challenged for you in your ministry today. We'll talk about some of the paradigms that are happening. Right when we kicked off this call, we're 2 days before the start of school here at my household, and I have a house full of kids upstairs. And so right as the call started, there was a big, huge, loud crash and then a scream. So what are the challenge? That was a change in paradigms of how I operate most of my days, and trying to work through that. What are the paradigms being challenged in your ministry today? Go ahead and put those in the chat and see how those come up. There we go. Gathering frequently in person, being able to plan for a year at a time. That's a huge one. Meeting in person, huge paradigm shift. Any others? Fundraiser for our mission. Yeah, how do we engage our supporters? Civility and public discourse. Very good. Overlapping purposes, planning ahead, mask or no mask. Now we're coming in. There we go. Children present in large groups, taking care of our elderly. I saw another one up there. Being able to send online in meaningful ways. Wonderful. The U.S. is not as stable as I used to think. Great. As we continue to think through those and what they're going to look like, we find ourselves in those moments. So look through those paradigms. Those are huge shifts for all of us as we kind of work through what those paradigms are and what the implications are for us. Communion, that's a huge one. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks for answering those celebrations and sacraments in new ways. How many times have we said this phrase in this past year? That virtual church service or that virtual mass, that formation meeting, that virtual meeting, it's just not the same. Usually we're referencing that in comparison to being as the face-to-face encounter. that primary incarnational encounter that we like. And you're right, they are not the same, but they're not supposed to be the same. Heidi Campbell, in her article on distancing religion online, she talks about 3 ways in which we moved online during the pandemic. In the first case, we transferred. That is, we had an attempt to replicate whatever it is that we do in person and just put it online, which this led to a greater sense of not being the same. It just kept that distance from it. Then the next level was really around translation. In the translation phase, we adapted some aspects of what we do in person, and then we put it online, but we understood the constraints of a virtual only. It created challenges in building community and engagement, but it also enabled different levels of community engagement and brought together groups that may not have come together before. Think about this, the gathering of Catholic Cares today. Then there's the transformational level. And she talks about the transformation, but really being about how we can embrace what technology could facilitate to build community and engagement. This is where we should focus going forward. I'm mindful that, when I used to lead formation groups or meetings, it was really in the face-to-face world, it was easy. I came in, I had my material, I could facilitate a conversation, help get others involved in that process, but it really was a little bit easier. In this online environment, in the transformational space, it takes a team of people. So it's a big shift in moving from individual or co-facilitation to now it's a team effort to really get an effort like this off the ground. So when we move to this transformational stage, we do not think of the virtual world as a less than, but we alter our approaches to maximize what it can do for us in this conversation. And it calls us to readiness and to readdress our paradigms. So all of the paradigms we put forward, looking for new ways to think about that. For me and for Mercy, we really looked at embracing this as a digital first and strategy. And the reason why digital first is that, and our bias is always in the face-to-face, but to go digital first, it's so that the solution is not an afterthought, but it's integral to the overall response. And it points to that face-to-face reality. So I had the privilege over the course of this past year to be a part of the inaugural Lilly Endowed Fellowship in Church Communications Ecology with the University of Notre Dame's McGrath Institute on Church Life. Now, this image you have in front of us is one of the main images that elicited my approach of thinking through this, moving from formation programs that we offer or ways in which they're isolated to really understanding our paradigms and creating an ecology with a digital first strategy. The working together of what's in the environment that we can help support with the technology that's behind it. So in the communications ecology program, we really took a deep dive in understanding the rapid changing cultural context, which we minister and gain some clarity around in kind of this, our own personal and professional values, mission, vision, purpose, and kind of find ways to do that in the digital age. This was, for me, the beginning of my shift. Next slide, please. So there's this adage from Marshall McLuhan that has stuck with me. It's been around for a long time, but we say the medium is the message. And in the medium is the message, Marshall really has us think about 2 issues, the figure and the ground. And so often in our current society, in a divided society, we really look at the figure and not really around the cultural elements that support it. So when we look at that, there's an opportunity for us to really think through, and Marshall proposes 4 ways in which we look and understand that using this tetrad of questions. So in the first, to really think about what does this technology enhance, or what does this medium enhance? So that enhancement, what does the medium improve? What does it retrieve? What's the original idea or ground that's being brought back by the medium? What it reverses, what's it push when it's pushed to its limits? And then what does it make obsolete? Those 4 questions. So think about the Zoom call or WebEx calls, that whatever it is that we're on, these video chats. We can say that it enhances a sense of group feeling. The video calls us to allow the group to remain connected, no matter the distance. However, when it's pushed to its limits, these calls can be another part of the noise or overload, and they fail to connect us instead of instead it fuels isolation in people. This is true of sometimes the much larger video calls. And these virtual tools can retrieve a kind of campfire service. This past weekend, I was at camping over the weekend and just sitting around with a small group of people around the glowing light, sharing stories and spiritual beliefs. So using these tools, it also makes obsolete, though, the particularity of place. Namely that for us in this case is the office. So the online tools and environment can shift the way in which we experience the effects of formation and the message that we send out there. But it also affects the receptivity. And this, when we're not physically gathered together, this discarnate communication calls into question a dilemma around that incarnational reality of the ministry we're charged to bring to life. Online methods can lead us to believe that the purpose of communication is information. So we need to see communication at the service of community and ultimately communion and the common good. Next slide, please. So as Marshall McLuhan says, the medium is the message. I have this quote from Pope Benedict in Silence on the Word on World Communications Day. McLuhan points that the content is shaped by the medium that is used to deliver the message. And McLuhan's interested in the formal cause of the medium and not just the efficient cause. So for digital and virtual formation, looking at the same thing, think about if a material cause was the beginning of a thing, the wood for a table, for instance, the formal cause is related to the design of the wood being changed to eventually become the table. So when we talk about our message we put out in the digital and virtual structures, we focus on the content, which is a valid focus. However, to focus on the ecology should also be a significant focus. So for speech to make sense, there must be a moment for silence. And in the virtual world, it's an age of distraction. It requires us to sufficiently explore all of these things throughout, and it helps shape our meaning and purpose when we look at this virtual space. How do we bring silence to our work as we kind of think through most of this? As I think about what the fall, for me, the questions I'm leaning into in the fall, if you go to the next slide, there's a lot of questions here. But anyway, our move to this fall with the COVID variant surges will be an opportunity to truly move into a transformative space, a place of innovation. Not that we were not there when we first came into the pandemic. It was not that it wasn't innovative, but it was an emergency response. So as we look into the fall, the virtual is going to be with us more. The front doors to our churches, to our ministries has changed to a virtual front door. And in responding and preparing for the fall, these are the questions that I'm leaning into this fall, trying to really think through what does it look like to have a discarnate reality of digital and virtual formation affect our incarnate ministries culture? What is it? How do we enable new connections or deepening our connections within it and build stronger communities and ultimate communion? What's the methodology in which we're going to help bring forward to help provide counter formation, if you will? Because in the ecology of the world around us, they're being told different things and it's very divisive. The same devices that we find ourselves on is part of the distraction economy. So how do we help ourselves find ourselves in the communion economy in the midst of these technological fixes? So the question I have for you is, what are the questions that you were leaning into this fall? This is some of my list, but as you lean into this fall, what are the questions that you were leaning into this fall? Thanks so much. We'll go to the question and answer session at this point.
Thanks, Jared, so much. I'm trying to get all of us up here. Be patient with me as I'm spotlighting everybody. I would love to open this up to the group for questions, but before that, I'd like the team to go ahead and be able to ask Jared some clarification points or maybe some initiating questions to start the conversation. But Jared, I know for me, something that surfaced is the model of communication. You know, what are your recommendations as far as living into a model of communication that really demonstrates that kind of incarnational sense of being connected virtually and digitally, because I find that people are very impatient when we have to change our plans, and so we get wrapped up in a lot of not, well, I guess very incarnational in the sense that we're feeling people's different emotions. But how do we navigate that communication aspect and really maybe be proactive in building a culture of incarnation using digital means? Do you have any recommendations on that?
I think if I figured that one out, we'll all have new realities for ourselves, right? But I'll just take a venture. One of the things that we're looking at for ourselves is what are the templates that we need to be intentional about when we have meetings, and in this virtual space. So, for instance, in this space virtually, it's much more transactional. People, if you notice, I don't know for anyone else, but for me, our meetings turn into much more transaction. Let's get through the point and get off this call and then move to the next one. But really setting up time to build the relational. So in the format of our meetings going forward, the first 10 minutes, it's going to be a drama. But how do we help build the relationship amongst those that are on the call? And do we keep the calls smaller versus larger? One of the avenues we've also done is maybe not always have the video on, but really turn the screen off so you're not having a visual conversation you're trying to study the 16 or 17 cues, but really listen to the person differently. So those are just some things that we've been piloting and trying to really get into the incarnation. It's tough when you're not in the physical space, but how do you sense the person at a deeper level? And how do you make room for that and not transactional? It becomes a key.
I think that's really interesting of what you just brought up about that transactional aspect. And I was really moved by what you said about communication is about community, not just transmitting information. And isn't that what we all try to do about trying to build community? And in this aspect of the digital world that we're in, I just thanks for that feedback about listening deeper, and maybe turning off the video so you actually try to build that relationship even beyond the cloud, the interwebs. You remind me, there's an exercise that I do with my students when I'm teaching them meditation. And I always ask them, I put the word listen on the board, and I ask them to move the letters around, and eventually it comes to the word silent. And using that tool with them helps them understand about listening and the relationship with silence much more clear. And how do we communicate that? How do we communicate silence and be together with that?
Yeah, that's a great. We had the last 5 minutes of my last formation session I did last week. We literally, all of us were on it's a virtual formation session, and we turned off our cameras, and we asked a journaling question, and turned off the cameras and just sent for the last 5 minutes, letting them journal, and then came back to the group for the group sharing. It was a different level of silence that they entered into. But yeah, it was so profound for the folks on that team to be on a Zoom call and still experience a little bit more of peace. So that's a great observation.
One thing that I wanted to mention, I noticed the question just came up in the chat about how do you balance in person with virtual if you have participants in both places, and those are some of the most challenging gatherings I think I've had been part of or tried to facilitate. And to your point, Jared, of it being transactional rather than real conversation, sometimes I find you have to use the transactional aspect of it to create conversation. So I will set up a expectation in the beginning, especially if it's kind of a brainstorming session or something where we really need to hear from everyone. You cannot rely on the cues that you have when you're in person of somebody taking a breath or somebody leaning forward in their chair and you know that they've got something to say. So we'll go around the room, right, when there's a point of conversation and say, okay, Jared, do you have anything to share? With the expectation that you can pass if you want to, or you can say, come back to me later. So you have to turn it into a more of a transactional way of getting at that organic communication. And I think that's really important when you have some people in person and some people on video or audio conferences. Don't forget to ask specifically, for the input of the people who are not present in the room, because they won't naturally be able to do it. And people are really uncomfortable about disturbing that silence of a call, right?
That's a great point.
I also saw a question about engaging employees or staff virtually. And Word and Witness has actually been really across the US staff prior to the pandemic, and has been using virtual means to connect. And one of my key insights as kind of like a supervisor of multiple employees is really to make that authentic time to check in with each of your staff, to as much as it is to your capacity. I have a small staff, so I have time to do that, but really setting aside that weekly time. And it's not just about like, okay, what are the projects we're working on? What's the update on that? But it's really, especially during this critical time, it's like really kind of understanding what reality they're facing. Because each local area is so different for our employees, that it's really a temperature check. What's going on locally? How is that affecting you and your family? How is that affecting your kind of motivation at work? What can I do to support? And then we also host regular staff meetings that also allow for that time together, so that there's a sense of understanding of the community at large. But when you have those connections, like Jared was saying, it helps motivate people, because people feel heard, people feel supported, and you adjust accordingly, right? When you hear of different updates, you adjust in order to make sure that person feels supported and heard and kind of respected, right, in their diverse realities. So that's my thought on that. So I think we're at our time on these questions, but I just want to make sure we're not missing anything. So I just hear another affirmation about small group settings, but I also see a question about issues of polarization and how we can address that within our communities. I know that that's something we could probably continue with, especially after we heard Douglas's presentation, because I think he gets us a good framework for how we make value-based decisions and how that can really drive communal culture. And then help us kind of come together a little bit more unified in our approaches. So if we can hold off on that one, I think we would be good to head over to Douglas's piece. Thank you, Jared, so much. So I'm gonna have you take it from here, Douglas.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Margaret. And thanks, Jared, for that conversation. I think it's so important. Good setup for the rest of our conversation here this afternoon about the way our mission and our values need to play into how we prepare for the fall, and how we prepare always, really. And I think we'll come to those slides later, Victoria, so you can take them away for now. Thank you. So really, I want to start by talking just about the importance of our mission and having a mission statement and having a clearly defined mission for our organization. That's important at all times, but it is really important in a time of crisis, because there's so much need, there's so much to do, and so much that we could do, that our mission is really important in helping us to focus on what is ours to do. It helps us not to be overwhelmed by the tremendous need that it's in the world and in our communities. It can help us, even if we have a personal mission statement, it can help us to avoid some of that burnout that Jared was talking about, which I'm also part of a Catholic health system, and we're seeing the same burnout crisis among our caregivers, and trying to find ways to help them reconnect that sense of personal mission and purpose for the work that they're doing, to hold on to that passion that drove them into healthcare in the first place, and to hopefully mitigate some of the effects of burnout. A mission keeps us focused. It tells us who we are, why we exist, where and when we're situated, tells us who we serve. None of us can serve the whole world. So each of us serve either a geographic part of that world, or maybe a demographic subset of that world. It reminds us too of how we're unique or different. It reminds us what gifts we have to offer as an organization, as a ministry, and what needs really we can address. It's important that we understand our mission and that we publicize it too, because our mission attracts other people to our work. It helps
people understand who we are and why they might want to join with us in the work that we do. And the Catholic Cares Coalition is a great example of that, right? We're all here today because we were attracted by the mission of Catholic Cares. And we understood very clearly and succinctly what this organization was about. And that allowed us to say, yes, I want our organization, or we want to be part of this work. So in the same way, our mission statement of our ministries helps attract others to our work, and we certainly need as many resources as we can gather. So it attracts people who are passionate about the same things that we're passionate about. Helps us to identify our stakeholders, our partners, and the communities that we serve. A mission statement also reminds us what we don't do. A mission statement also reminds us that there are other people who might address needs in the community better than we can. You know, early on in the pandemic, when testing was so difficult to access, a number of our medical groups here in Southern California decided to open drive-through testing clinics. And it was interesting. Some of the clinics were fairly busy, some were not so much. Eventually, as testing became more and more available, the need diminished. And so after a period of time, those clinics were closed. It was a really good use of our resources because many people were not coming into our medical clinics for care at that time. We were doing a lot of telehealth visits, or unfortunately, some people were just postponing care altogether. Later, when the vaccines became available, some of our clinics again looked at, let's start a drive-through vaccine clinic. And as we started planning for that, looking at some of our larger sites that had larger parking lots that we could do this in, we realized that we were going to take up a lot of space in these parking lots with our drive-through vaccine clinic. And our clinics now, our regular medical clinics were getting busier. People were coming back for care that they had delayed. And the space that we were going to be taking up in the parking lot for the vaccine clinic was going to make it more difficult for our patients to come see us. Our clinics were getting busier. We didn't have as many resources. And we realized that it probably wasn't as faithful to our mission to be setting up this vaccine clinic when there were other people in the community who could do it better than we could. And in fact, we learned that a community college not too far from our clinic location was going to be a county vaccination site. The county has all sorts of logistical experts and the police department that can direct traffic that we didn't have as a ministry. So although it was a great idea and certainly a need in our community, we realized it wasn't ours to do. What was better for us was to be there for the patients that needed us for their healthcare. So being able to say no to certain things because it's not the best expression of our mission can help us actually to avoid burnout, rather than stretching our resources so thin that we don't do anything really well. A mission can help us focus our resources on one or a few things that we can really succeed at. So everything that we do should be a touchstone for, a mission should be a touchstone for everything we do. Every time there's a new program or initiative, we should be asking, is this consistent with our mission? When we look at budgets, when we look at space planning, when we look at hiring, we should always be asking, does this new hire, does this budget, does the way that we're calendaring our events accurately reflect our mission and our values? A mission statement can also help us pare down the work that we're doing so we can focus on what's really important. I know for a lot of ministries tend to grow by accretion. We get involved in certain projects or initiatives or processes. Over the years, for various reasons, I was part of an organization that had a number of programs that they were offering that really didn't seem core to who they were as an organization. And it actually was an earlier executive director who was passionate about these few things and brought these programs into the organization. A few years after that executive director left, the organization was still maintaining those programs. And then they had to take a really hard look and say, you know, this is really not core to who we are. We need to let go of some of this stuff. And that's really important for us to do because, especially in a crisis, we need all the resources we have at our disposal to address the needs of the crisis. So our mission can help us to kind of clean house occasionally and make sure that what we are focusing on is what we should be focusing on. I think it's helpful to remember that there are three basic approaches to living out the gospel, building the kingdom from an organizational standpoint. And these have been described in various different ways by different authors, but sort of broadly, there's the immediate needs that need to be met. And our organization or ministry might be dedicated to meeting those immediate needs of the homeless population, of the elderly. Providing a charity care was something that we do within healthcare, because those are immediate needs that we can meet. Other organizations might be focused on educating and empowering other people to act, might be responsible for formation and really healing of persons and systems. I think a lot of the organizations that are part of Catholic Cares, a number of them have this as kind of their core mission. So we might not be out doing the work ourselves, but we are empowering and forming others to do it in a way that is effective and responsive. And then the third type of advocacy, activism or social concern, way of responding to the gospel is through advocacy, through influencing the influencers, trying to work for systemic change. And all three of those tasks are important, and all three of them are gospel-based. They're all ways to respond to the gospel. So no one should be prioritized over the other. But it can be freeing for you as an organization to realize that you're doing what space you're acting in, so you can know that there are others who are acting in those other spaces. And you can feel good about the work that you're doing as it integrates and relates with those other two spaces that you might not be as involved in. So if our mission tells us what we do, then our values tell us how we do it. Our core values tell us how we're in relationship to ourselves, to others, to the community, to the wider world. And it's important, I think, to be constantly attentive to our mission and our values. They are there to inspire us, but they're also there to hold us accountable. It's so easy to slip, as I mentioned, organizations that sort of take on things that really aren't core to who they are. There's one organization that had their values chiseled into the marble of their lobby at their headquarters. The values were communication, respect, integrity, and excellence. And that organization was Enron. So just because we have a mission and values doesn't mean that we're always acting in accordance with them. So it can be helpful from time to time to stop and say, and take a deeper dive into how faithful we are being to our mission and our values. In Catholic healthcare, many of the Catholic healthcare institutions do something like a values review process or ministry fidelity assessment on a regular basis, every 3 or 5 or 7 years, to take a deep dive into key performance indicators that show how well are we living up to our mission and our values. As an organization, you might decide to do that from time to time. Maybe a board retreat or a staff day would be a good day every few years to look at how you're living out your mission and your values on a day-to-day basis. My role within Providence as a mission integration leader is exactly that. That's my job, is to ensure that the ministries that I support are living out the mission and values of the organization. The new board of In Word and Witness in the bylaws has a role called the core value assessor, whose job it is to ensure that the board decisions resonate and connect to the values of the organization. That also happens to be my job on the board. It can be, you don't necessarily need to have a full-time person whose full-time job is to do this, but it might not be a bad idea to be intentional, to ask someone in your organization to take this on, to make sure that you stay accountable to the mission and values of your organization. I know one ministry that started every meeting with a reading of their mission statement and their values, and identified what part of the mission statement and which of the values would be touched on during the content of the meeting. I think that's an amazing way to keep the mission and values at the forefront. So I want to pause for a second in this conversation and ask you to reflect on your own mission statement, your organization's mission statement, or maybe even your own personal mission statement if you've spent some time thinking about that. And what seems to be speaking most loudly to you of your mission statement as you prepare for fall in 2021? Which of your values seem to be calling you to pay particular attention to your planning for the fall? How does your mission and value statement call you to respond to the signs of the times right now? And I ask you to do that just for your own personal reflection. If you want to share it in the chat, feel free to do so, but just take a pause and ask yourself that question before we continue our conversation. Yeah, that's a great question about when do we do it and when do we partner with somebody else? And I think that kind of will get to some of those. Hopefully we'll talk a little bit about a framework that might help with some of those decisions as we continue our conversation. Love one another as I have loved you. What a great mission statement that is. Absolutely. So continue to think about that and we'll continue our conversation. And Victoria, if you could pull up the slides now, that would be great. Thank you so much. So I want to talk for the next few minutes about a way of making decisions that keep our mission and our values at the forefront. Values-based decision-making, and you'll find a lot of information out there around ethical decision-making, ethical approaches to decisions, and some of this builds on that work, but I'm talking specifically not just about ethics, although that's certainly part of the conversation, but about really how do you use your values and your mission to make decisions for your organization. And they occur at kind of different levels, right? There are different levels of complexity when we look at these values-based decision-making. First is the everyday decisions that you make as a leader in your organization. You make dozens of these decisions in your role. You make dozens of personal decisions as well. And the hope is that they're all grounded in mission and values, that as you're making these seemingly small decisions, you're keeping your mission and your values at the forefront as these decisions are being made. As decisions get a little bit more complex, you might need to bring in some external resources or internal resources. You might get into a conversation with someone else in your organization and ask them to help flesh out whether or not what decision seems to be most consistent with your mission and your values. It can be really important, as Jared pointed out, to make sure that you're responding to the reality of the stakeholders that you are serving. A lot of times, I think in ministry, we think we know what people need and want, but we often don't really look at the data that show what they need and want. So you might need an outside consultant, an outside expert, or even just a member of the stakeholder community to enter into that conversation with you to help you understand what is the reality that you need to be able to respond to, what is really going on, and that's going to inform your ability to respond. And then at the next level, it's more of a group or community decision. You might need to bring together a group of people to ask this question and be intentional about, we need to meet to decide how are we going to do this ourselves, this particular program or initiative, or are we going to partner with someone else, or are we going to let somebody else do it entirely? And to make that the focus of the conversation, inviting stakeholders of the community into that conversation as much as possible is really important. We'll dive a little bit more into that in a moment. And then the last most sort of robust way of doing values-based decision-making is a formal structured discernment process. Now, this is probably a major decision that's affecting a change in your mission or identity or the community that you serve. Maybe you're deciding to move into serving a different community or stop serving a particular community that you've served historically, something that's going to have a major investment of resources or time and money. If you know a little bit about the history of In Word and Witness, the transition from NCCL to In Word and Witness, that was a major discernment process that the board and the organization went through and facilitated by us, outside consultants. So next slide, Victoria, please. So in all of those types of conversations, but especially in the most complex ones, those last two, some of the things that you're going to need to be considering as you do values-based decision-making is define the question. What are you trying to decide? And that's often the key step. Very often values-based decision-making fails because we don't define the question correctly. So a good question, like someone put in the chat, how do we do this initiative on our own? Do we partner with someone else in the community, or do we not do it at all and allow somebody else in the community to serve it? Second question, do I have the right data, as we talked about? Do I have all the right stakeholders in the conversation? If it's not possible to get a stakeholder from the community you serve to participate in the conversation, then assign someone in your organization to be the voice of those stakeholders and make sure that they understand that that's their role. And then the question you're going to be asking is, what is consistent with our mission? What is consistent with core values? What is consistent with principles of Catholic social teaching? The common good, preferential options, stewardship of resources, subsidiarity, all of those aspects of Catholic social teaching should be impacting the decisions that we're making in the near term, because all of them are being played out in our response to the pandemic. And then next slide, go ahead and make the decision. It's important to communicate the decision, and not just to communicate what you're going to do, but I think it's important for your stakeholders to know that you went through a values-based decision-making process to come to this decision. So they understand that this wasn't just a capricious response to a supposed need. And then it's always important to evaluate how well you did down the road. So the evaluation that we did about the testing sites, it was a really successful, but it was quickly not needed, helped us to inform, to be able to let go of the idea of doing a vaccine. So my last question for you to consider before we open it up into conversation is there a decision that you're wrestling with as an organization? And I've seen some people already putting some of that in the chat, that you might want to bring to a values-based decision-making process like we've talked about here. Within your own organization or your own ministry, is there a decision that you're wrestling with or a question you're wrestling with that a process like this might be helpful to you as you move into planning for fall of 2021? Thanks.
I think, Douglas, you have a few questions in there if you'd like me to read them out.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. How do we make what we offer virtually more equitable? Because I think an access is seeming to be probably a foundational issue from this question. They want to make sure it's equitable to everybody in their community. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, I think that's a great question to ask if there are partners within the community that can help with that access, because it's not just our problem, right? It's a problem that schools are having. It's a problem that other workplaces are having. So if you are not in a technology-based ministry, then I would say you probably are looking at partnering with other organizations to find ways to create a technology that's available. A good way of starting might be to get the data about what do your constituents have access to. You know, if we're assuming that everybody's got access to a laptop, then you're probably not going to, you're going to find a lot of inequity. But if you can do something off of a cell phone, a lot more people have access to that technology. And so can you pivot to to offer something that can be used with various kinds of technology. So those folks who have one type can access it, as well as those who have a different type. Can you do things that are not as bandwidth heavy? So people who don't have access to high broadband internet service can also participate. So get a good sense. You may need, again, some outside research or to dig around to see what do your stakeholders have that they can use, and are there partner organizations that you can work with to provide and close some of those gaps.
Also, Douglas, as you're asking the question, to prompt people to reflect upon their mission statement and their core values, I wonder your thoughts on what if there isn't an explicit mission statement or set of core values? Because I think that right now is leading to a lot of confusion when it comes to making critical decisions during this time. Or maybe the statement is just so broad that folks are having difficulty without those core values explicitly outlined, agreeing on decisions. Do you have any recommendations when it comes to that?
That's a tough one, because ideally a crisis is not the time to go and create your mission statement, right? So there's value to have done that work, but if it's not done, then I think you need to ask yourself some of the questions that we asked in the beginning. What really are the gifts and talents that we have within the organization? What are the resources we have in the organization? And who are we serving? So what do we have to offer? Who and where are we serving? And how deep are our resources? If you can answer those three questions, and there are probably three more, and Jared, you might have some other questions, then you can build a framework. You might not be able to say it's a mission statement, but you can say, okay, we are serving people of this community. So this great idea or great need that exists over here in this other community that people are coming and saying, hey, can you do something about? We're going to say no, because that's not who we are serving. That's not who we are most familiar with and have the established relationship with. So maybe if you can answer those questions first, then it will help you drive some of those decisions.
Yeah, thank you. I think that just hearing the permission to say no, I think is probably empowering to folks, but also I think to really analyze where you are right now in this moment, and who are you serving in this moment too, and really kind of wrestling with the reality that the data is changing about that. Who your community was a year and a half ago is not who your community is today for a variety of reasons. It might still be the same people, but how they're coming to your community has been ever changed. And so that gives you a bit of permission to let go of things that aren't necessarily working, and make communal decisions that will affect the need for the now of that particular network of folks. So thank you for that. Also, I had one more question, Douglas. Stakeholders, can you give a little bit more definition of what that would mean for people? That came up in the chat during your presentation.
Yeah, stakeholders would be there are various groups of stakeholders, right? And as many voices as you can have in the decision-making process, or at least keeping them in mind as you make the decision, the better you're going to be. I would say the primary group is the community that you serve. And again, it might be a geographic community, it might be a demographic community. To your point, well taken, Margaret, your community may have changed over the past year. Your stakeholders are also your investors, so to speak, not necessarily financial investment, but perhaps if you work in a parish or a diocese, then your stakeholders would be the bishops and would be the other communities that serve with you. They would be considered stakeholders. Someone pointed out in the chat that we're also serving our staff and our employees. And yeah, that is an important group of stakeholders as well. And then the people in your community that you have intentionally or historically or continually partnered with. It's often important to consider how a new partnership might affect those partnerships that you already have established. So based on what the question is, all of those stakeholders might not need to be present. You might need to just keep in mind what those stakeholders would be expecting of you or would need to hear from you about in terms of what you wanted to communicate a decision. You might go out and do a pre-assessment with some of those stakeholders and say, hey, we're discerning this question. We would like your input on it. And then in the conversation, you can bring that input in. So it's basically all of the people or groups of people that your organization touches, but those are some of the major folks that I would say would be stakeholders.
So also, Jared, when I heard Douglas speak on the advocacy issue as part of the layers of that decision making, I was thinking about your statement about like there is no going back. We're not going back to something that once was. So I'm wondering, can you speak a little bit to how to promote advocacy to address systemic change that needs to happen when we're looking at what's expected of us for fall in ministry and how we can kind of navigate working through some systemic change issues to help us navigate that a little bit more freely and a little bit more openly into something more innovative?
That's a major question. So thanks for that. I think, just as a first pass in that conversation, really around a formal advocacy we think about our ministries as being relational. And as we look at the relationships that we've already connected in the community, so often those relationships that we already have can be furthered through the digital means, but we're also being challenged to actually establish the relationships in this digital mean. Kind of new world of conversation. So how do we help really build the relational aspect that's core to who we are as our identity as ministry? And so if you, one of my roles is on the Missouri Catholic Conference. And so when we walk the halls of Jefferson City, our state capital, and it's quite polarizing to be in that. And yet, as the Missouri Catholic Conference, we walk on both sides of the aisle in terms of building the relationship across, regardless of party platform. And so looking at that same process when we look at virtually, how do we help establish the relationship and keep it going that gets us across it? It's going to be relational. It's a lot labor intensive in terms of one-on-one or one-on-two or whatever it looks like, but it's got to be back to the relational piece. If it's not there, then it's not authentic to who we are as our own identity as well.
Yeah, I did see earlier in the conversation, in the chat, this idea of not just being able to plan something for the year and kind of be done with that planning process, that's been a huge pivot, that folks it's not so simple anymore, that it really is day-to-day decision making. So just wondering, Douglas, I know that was part of your process on that kind of decision as a leader. Do you have any recommendations or wisdom to offer folks that are having to pivot from giving that year-long calendar of this is what we're doing and this is when we need you on site to now we actually really are making decisions day to day? Do you have any recommendations or wisdom to offer folks as they pivot?
I think, invest in a crystal ball. It's probably the best investment you'll make this year. But seriously, I think that's when it's so important to keep the mission and values in mind. Because instead of saying, how do we do communion virtually, which we know, right, we really can't. What is the mission of our parish around communion? And how can we do that virtually? How do we do, sacramental prep virtually? Well, what is the mission? What are the values that we're trying to instill in sacramental prep or outreach to the poor and vulnerable? How does that look if we can't serve food at a homeless shelter anymore? Well, what is the mission of that ministry? What is the mission of that work? And if we understand what the mission is of that work, then we ask ourselves the question, how can we do that virtually? So as long as we keep coming back to the mission and understand that the individual planning of a year-long calendar is really 12 months worth of ways of acting and living out of our mission, then the particulars of how that happens shouldn't be, it will take some creativity, certainly, but we can say, oh, we're not delivering sandwiches to a homeless shelter, but we still are delivering on our mission of connecting people with the poor and vulnerable by a letter writing campaign to, cards of support and encouragement to people who are going through COVID at a homeless shelter, in an isolation ward, something like that, where our mission is still how we're delivering it. We just might have to pivot to deliver it in a different way.
I also think, Douglas, that lends itself to this idea of strategic partnerships. So when you're asking the question and you've grappled in your community or your faith leader conversations about, well, this is our mission around this particular ministry or this particular initiative, but we know we can't provide that resource in this way right now because we just don't have the capacity. But we know that if we contact this community, that's primarily what they're focused on, we can collaborate to help them be more effective in this space and us be more effective in this space, and still both achieving that common sense of mission and purpose. Let's say it's for outreach to the poor. So it's really also being really particular about forming those strategic partnerships in a way that we're all thriving in that context. And that actually lends itself, for those that are on the call, that we encourage you to invite a friend for next week, because we're actually going to look at some models for how to do that type of work, how to build strategic partners in a community itself, where a parish might be doing one aspect, but maybe, a food pantry might be doing another, the health system might be doing another, but together they're collaborating for a common sense of purpose and mission that overlap. So I encourage you to kind of see Douglas's recommendations come into effect next week. But Jared, I think many of us are wondering, as we're trying to navigate for fall and are having to make critical decisions around in-person, virtual, masking, not masking, and we're dealing with a lot of polarization around these issues. I was thinking of your concept of the ecology piece, and it's almost like there's like a hierarchy of needs, right, to assure that the particulars of these decisions affect that common good. Do you have any recommendations for folks that are navigating the polarization piece as far as making decisions of maybe prioritizing digital or, masking, not masking? Any thoughts?
Yeah. So back to Douglas's conversation around really getting crystal clear as your mission and making that conversation around that. And then not getting caught up in the tyranny of the or. So it's in polarization. When you look at the digital and virtual environment, it really puts us into an individualistic concept or mindset, and it really puts us into either or. And for those of us in the spiritual conversations, that's just the ego really at work in us and really kind of working overtime in that conversation. So how do we help move that beyond an or conversation to an and conversation, to the both and, get off the polarization and really enter into that space? And it might also mean looking like we don't always have the right answers, because people are looking for the right answers. And that's what the ego is doing to us, right? It's making us look for the right answer. And yet at the same time, how do we help make this a communal effort? So when we look at our mission, we look at our values, we look to make the decisions that are crystal clear about what we're looking for. And we move toward the decisions and the conversation that move us away from the either or and the both and, but to make it that communal conversation. In a parish just down the street, we had a conversation around masking at the school and at the parish level. And as a community, it's a very divided conversation. And yet the way in which it was handled and it's navigating right now, masking and non-masking is still showing up. And how we're getting through it, it's not pretty. It's not pretty at all. But the reality is we're at least having a conversation about it. It's not the shouting match that's putting us into further polarity, but it is a conversation to understand at greater speed what's behind the conversation for others. So it really is the messy part, but it's the relational part. And I think that's, whether it's you're going to virtual, how do you create the conversation so people feel safe? How do you make the space where there is that room, and look at the ideas and not necessarily just kind of walk through that? That's just the current example that I'm looking at in this parish I'm working with.
You just brought up that aspect of building a safe space online, but what happens if we are able to be vulnerable enough and ask ourselves, can we create brave spaces as well? especially as we look at all this digital opportunities in our own discernment and our own formation, especially as we look at this opportunity for our communities.
Indeed. So folks, is there any other pending questions before we go into some announcements that we have? Just want to make sure you all could raise your hand if you have an additional question to ask. While they're thinking about that, I did see, Jared, while you were talking, that someone was typing a really reflective piece here that complemented what you were saying, but that sometimes, the decisions that are being made at certain levels might be in contradiction to some of those core values that we have as faith communities. And so it's really, there's a request of advice on how do you navigate people's ability to distinguish those layers of impact on your core values and that decision making. I know that Jared already attended to a component of that, but I wanted to make sure that there was that critical piece that was brought up in the chat around that communal expectation or decision making, let's say from your state, from your governor, and how that might be in contradiction with some of what your core values are in your community. Are there any tips on that particular piece of how to build that sense of community?
I think trying to live out our communal understanding of the world in an American individualist context is going to be challenging no matter how we look at it. And subsidiarity becomes a challenge. And yet what happens at higher levels of the authority is when we're not able to make the decisions locally, there are others that need to help navigate that, right? So how do we find ourselves to be in solidarity? I think the Holy Father calls us to a greater solidarity with those. And it's not just, a glib moment of that, but how do we really journey with the people who are not liking the higher decisions, or maybe they do like it. But how does it really help us journey with? And that's a different place to put ourselves in, because it's so easy to get caught up in trying to be in the narrative and creating the further noise and isolation and polarization. I think as Catholic ministries, we're called to heal those divides, regardless of where it is, which means journeying with them somehow in solidarity and working through that.
I think another thing is not to overlook that piece of the 3 responses of formation. It's so important, and it feels like when there's so much need out there, it feels like, well, we don't want to waste time on formation because we need to address the needs or even advocate for change. But the more we can form individuals and groups and systems on what Catholic social teaching really says about the common good, about subsidiarity, even when decisions, even of some of our own church leaders, are in conflict with that, we remain faithful to the gospel message that we were being asked to form people around. And remembering too, if nothing else, that the gospel is countercultural and always will be countercultural. And so I think we need to own that part of our ministry. If that is your ministry, if that is your mission, know that that is a critically important mission, especially at this time.
Well, I wanted to thank Douglas and Jared so much for their time today, and for all of you participating with these wonderful questions. I hope this has been really insightful for you. I know it has been for me. I'm very grateful, Douglas and Jared. Now I'd like the opportunity to introduce you to the convener of the Coalition of Catholic Cares, Donald McCrabb, who will be giving us a little bit of an update as far as what's going on with the coalition. Welcome, Don.
Margaret, thank you. And thank you very much, Douglas and Jared, for the conversation this afternoon. Very, very helpful. First, off the bat, we are now a coalition of 56 Catholic organizations. We are currently working on an advocacy piece. We have a letter that's going to Congress, both Senate and the House of Representatives, about appropriations. We want vaccine equity to be a part of that conversation. So we're now going through the sign-on process. That letter went out to all the members of the coalition last week, and we're asking people to sign on by tomorrow, Wednesday afternoon. So that's in progress. Third, we have funded 6 micro grants. We're very happy with those and very diverse. And so we're really excited about that. So the good news is that we funded 6 micro grants. The bad news is we're now out of money. But we do want to harvest the learnings from those micro grants. We're getting reports in, and they seem to be really working. They're moving the needle. More people are being vaccinated because of that work, and that's exactly what they were designed for. So we want to learn from them, harvest those stories, and make those available to the coalition as a whole. Second, the committee is really committed to working with people to help them refine their own ideas and to maybe do some problem solving as to how they can get funding for it, maybe locally or through other sources. And then finally, we are going to see if we can increase the funding that's available for micro grants by reaching out to other foundations. So that's kind of where that committee is at in terms of the micro grants. So at this point, we're out of money, but stay tuned. We're willing to work with you and also to see if we can raise additional funds for these grants, which are proving to be very effective. Lastly, I just want to mention about the steering committee. We do have a steering committee, and they're very faithful and they're very committed. Matter of fact, we meet every Wednesday morning. So, a pat on the back to them and a prayer of thanksgiving for that work. And we're really trying to stay on top of this virus and how it is just changing on a daily basis. And we try to reflect that in our weekly updates. So one of the things that we've been very concerned about, of course, is the increase in the Delta variant and how that is having an impact. And there's a lot of data that's coming out in terms of where the vaccine hesitancy is, where the resistance is the strongest, and where there's problems. One of the things that the challenge that we're going to be facing is, for lack of better terms, is the pandemic fatigue. I mean, we're all tired of it, right? We all just wanted to go away. Well, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, but the last 100 miles are probably the most difficult ones to take because we're tired and the terrain is rough and we don't see the end until we make that final bend, right? So it's kind of, we have to really pray for the grace of perseverance in this time. And of course, things emerge even within our leadership. And so there's sometimes challenges that are coming out by some church leaders. And we have to figure out how to appropriately respond to them. And that's one of the great gifts of the steering committee, because it's a place where we have the time and to respond rather than react. And as Doug was saying so clearly, continually coming back, what's our core values? What's our core mission? We want to promote vaccine acceptance. We want to promote and advocate for vaccine equity, not only here in the United States, but around the world. We want to help people understand the significance of it as part of their own faith formation. So we keep coming back to those core values, that core mission, and that seems to be serving us well.
Well, thank you, Don, so much for that great update. I'm sure you can hear more about the Advocacy Committee letter on our site. So just stay tuned, CatholicCares.org. Always look at our news feed. That's where we keep a lot of new and relevant content available. So we hope that you can explore that. Also, just a reminder, as I mentioned earlier, next week's session is on the topic of equity. As we were having conversations with the team that's going to speak on that, we definitely were having struggle around the issue of boosters, right? Especially as we have people around the world that haven't had access to any vaccines at all, and some of the moral implications involved in that. But also we're looking at the potential of expired vaccines in the US and what responsibility we bear and what we can do to be really influencers as faith leaders. So I hope you can come join us next week to to discuss these critical themes, and we'll have people be joining us from around the world and with a lot of experience on the distribution of vaccines and give you a lot of relevant data that hopefully will affect conversations in your local community and what they can do to make an impact. So thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it to John Michael for our closing prayer.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Margaret, for moderating and emceeing this afternoon. So before we close with prayer, I invite everyone, as you are able, to place into the chat a word or a phrase or an idea, an image. Basically, so what? What is your takeaway from this afternoon? So that in that collective wisdom, we can share together what we have learned. So more about patience and the idea of stakeholders, solidarity, intentionality. On mission. As we continue to form our hearts and minds, asking our own selves of what do we have to offer? Who are we serving? What resources do we have? We pray that that God of wisdom will be with us in these days to come. Take, oh, take me as I am. Summon out what I shall be. Set your seal upon my heart and live in me. Take, oh, take me as I am. Summon out what I shall be. Set your seal upon my heart and live in me. Let us pray. Spirit of guidance, we see before us numerous choices and decisions to be made. There is division in my heart. Sometimes I want none of what I find. Sometimes I want it all. Sometimes I want to give up decision making and wish that the future would go away. Yet I entrust my decision making into your hands, ready to do my part, but also knowing that I cannot do this without your help. Lead me through all the unsure, unclear, doubtful, hesitant, and questioning moments that are mine as I search to find the right way in which to go. Grant me the grace to choose freely without being attached to the outcome. I trust that you will be with me as I make my decision prayerfully and with faith. Assure me that your peace will rest deep within me as I make the decision that seems best for me at this time. And I know I may continue to experience feelings of turmoil and confusion, but deep within, I know that I can return to that settled place in me, to that inner chapel where you always dwell. Guide and director of my life, I place my life in your hands. Lead me to the path that will best deepen and strengthen my relationship with you, with my community, with myself. We ask this in faith, hope, and love. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for being here, and hope to see many of you next week.